Arirang News coming to you live from Seoul. I'm Kwon Jang-ho and it's good to have you with us. President Donald Trump has declared that the US could be on the way towards a trade deal with China. This comes after US and Chinese officials concluded 2 days of trade talks in Washington, but he also warned that they are not there yet and that he won't be backing down from raising tariffs for now. We'll have more on that story later in the programme, but first we catch up with the latest headlines with Devin Whiting at the News Centre. Devin?
Hi, Jang-ho. With the second North Korea-U.S. summit likely coming up in the next several weeks, the Trump administration's special envoy to the North is saying there needs to be tangible progress. From the next summit, among other things, the U.S. will want a full inventory of the regime's nuclear and missile stockpiles. Oh Jung-hee reports.
With the second Kim-Trump summit a matter of weeks away, the U.S. envoy for North Korea has stated a few things that must be agreed to at the summit to make sure the regime's denuclearization is final and fully verified. Giving a speech at Stanford University on Thursday, Stephen Biegun said the U.S. needs to have a full grasp on the extent of the North's nuclear and missile programs. He added,
"We must reach agreement on expert access and monitoring mechanisms of key sites to international standards. And ultimately, we need to ensure the removal and destruction of stockpiles of fissile material, weapons, missiles, launchers, and other weapons of mass destruction."
And while President Trump has depicted the ongoing nuclear negotiations in a positive light, his envoy stressed the U.S. has, quote, contingencies in case the negotiations fail.
As the diplomatic record of the past 25 years shows, they are too numerous to count. We need to have contingencies if the diplomatic process fails, which we do.
But Biegun added the U.S. is ready to pursue the denuclearization process, quote, simultaneously and in parallel, meaning both sides will have to make concessions along the way. He also reaffirmed that the U.S. wants to resolve the matter peacefully.
President Trump is ready to end this war. It is over. We are not going to invade North Korea. We are not seeking to topple the North Korean regime. We need to advance our diplomacy alongside our plans for denuclearization in a manner that sends that message clearly to North Korea as well. We are ready for a different future.
Such topics are expected to be further discussed between North Korea and the U.S. through their working-level talks early next week. The U.S. State Department says Biegun will travel to Seoul on Sunday for follow-up meetings with his North Korean counterpart after their last meeting in Sweden early last week. The U.S. envoy will be sitting down with his South Korean counterpart, Lee Do-hoon, as well. And according to President Trump, the date and the venue for the second summit will be announced in the coming days. Regarding the location, Trump says he doesn't think it's any great secret, hinting it could be Vietnam as widely seen. Oh Jung-hee, Arirang News.
A chain of scandals involving one of South Korea's biggest conglomerates, Hanjin Group, may have prompted one of its biggest shareholders to act. The National Pension Service, which has a roughly 7% share in the group's holding firm, Hanjin KAL, has decided to exercise its right as a major shareholder to intervene in the firm's management. Our Ko Ryun-hee explains.
After a 4-hour-long meeting, the National Pension Service has decided to play a management role at Hanjin KAL, marking the first time the state pension operator has intervened in managerial decisions of a private firm. Since its founding as Hanjin Group's holding company in 2013, Hanjin KAL provides a wide range of services, including tourism, and is best known for its subsidiary Korean Air, the country's flagship carrier. Currently, the NPS is the third largest shareholder in the company, with a stake of 7.34%. The Fund Management Committee of NPS, chaired by the Minister of Health and Welfare, announced on Friday it will use its shareholders' rights related to management in a limited way. For instance, the NPS will not be directly involved in business decisions such as dismissing its directors, but can push for changing the company's articles of association. The announcement comes after the NPS introduced a stewardship code last July as a way of protecting its interests as a shareholder. Minister Bang Nung-woo reiterated the importance of the code in Friday's meeting.
The purpose of the National Pension Service introducing the stewardship code is to raise the long-term profitability of the fund and to enhance shareholders' value. To achieve these goals, more active shareholder activities are possible.
This all comes following a number of scandals at Hanjin Group, after its chairman Cho Yang-ho last year was indicted on charges of embezzling corporate funds. Chairman Cho's daughter, Cho Yeon-na, the former executive vice president of Korean Air, also took a serious hit to her reputation after the infamous nut rage incident in 2014. Although the meeting's agenda included on whether to actively give input to Korean Air, the committee decided not to apply stewardship code nor intervene in its management. 고르니, Arirang News.
South Korea's exports were down in January for a second straight month, and it looks like that's because of the global economic slowdown. But things are looking better for the latter half of the year. Kim Ji-yeon reports.
Data released Friday by the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy show Korean exports dropped by 5.8% in January compared to the same period last year to around $46.4 billion. The country's imports also slumped by 1.7% on year to a little over $45 billion. Korea had a trade surplus for an 84th month in a row of $1.3 billion. As for why Korea shipped less of its main export items, semiconductors, petroleum, and petrochemicals, the Trade Ministry cited the global economic slowdown rather than local companies becoming less competitive. Falling global demand led to a drop in the prices of semiconductors and oil, but the ministry expects those will pick up during the latter half of the year. Semiconductor exports dropped last month by more than 23% on year to around $7.4 billion. Prices of DRAMs dropped 36.5%, while those of NAND flash memory chips decreased by more than 22%. Petrochemical exports dropped by 5.3% on year last month to nearly $4 billion, while petroleum goods decreased by nearly 5% on year to nearly $3.5 billion. By region, shipments to Korea's #1 export destination, China, contracted for the third consecutive month, mainly due to a slower Chinese economy. Exports grew, though, to the U.S. and the European Union, India, and Southeast Asia. Earlier this week, the government says support measures will be unveiled later this month, tailored to exporting industries, starting with the building of foreign plants, media content, and agricultural and fisheries products. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
The South Korean people paid their respects today to the late Kim Bok-dong, a woman who was sexually enslaved by the Japanese military during World War II and later became an iconic activist for justice. Kim died earlier this week at the age of 93. Hundreds of citizens gathered in front of the Japanese embassy in Seoul as part of her funeral procession, where her coffin was brought for a sending off. For decades, Kim had demanded that Japan apologize sincerely for its crimes and that it compensate its victims. With Kim's death, there are only 23 survivors of Japan's sexual slavery still living, raising concerns that time is running out for them to get a sincere apology. On Thursday, South Korea and Japan discussed a range of issues that have been straining their ties lately. Those include the Korean court rulings ordering Japanese companies to compensate the Korean people forced to work for them during World War II, and the recent disputed encounters between their militaries. According to Seoul's Foreign Ministry on Friday, South Korea's Director General for Northeast Asian Affairs, Kim Yong-gil, and his Japanese counterpart, Kenji Kanasugi, held talks on Thursday in Tokyo. Japanese broadcaster NHK reports that the two sides also exchanged views on the so-called Comfort Women Foundation, which the South Korean government decided to dissolve last year. It also reported that South Korea has still not responded to Tokyo's recent request for talks within the next 30 days on the forced labor rulings. I'm Devin Whiting, and those are your news headlines.
Two days of trade talks took place between US and Chinese officials in Washington this week, after which President Trump said progress is being made towards a trade deal. But he also warned that unless he strikes a, quote, very big deal, he could be willing to postpone it. Noaram has more.
President Trump has signaled that trade talks in Washington are going well. But he did say the US will not reach any final trade agreement with China until he sits down again with President Xi Jinping.
I think that probably the final deal will be made, if it's made, will be made between myself and President Xi.
He also said any deal made with China would be a big one, but added he is willing to wait for that to happen.
This is either going to be a very big deal, or it's going to be a deal that we'll just postpone for a little while.
When asked if he was willing to delay the March 2nd deadline on imposing tariffs on Chinese imports, Trump said he didn't know. He received a letter from Chinese President Xi Jinping sent via Beijing's Vice Premier Liu He, whom Trump met on Thursday. In the letter, Xi pledged to stay in close communication with the Trump administration and expressed hopes that both sides can reach an agreement. Expectations of the world's two biggest economies clinching any comprehensive deal over the next month are low. The US is essentially demanding China to lower its economic aspirations and claiming it is stealing American intellectual property. Beijing vehemently denies the allegations and is unlikely to easily give in to Washington's demands. Noaram, Arirang News.
Now joining us in the studio today, we have with us Jeongsuk, Professor of Economics at the Catholic University of Korea. It's good to have you with us here today.
Happy to be here.
So officials from Washington and Beijing held talks over the last 2 days, and it seems to have gone quite well. What were they trying to work out, and what progress do you think was made?
Okay, well, the easy issues have already worked out in the lower level meetings. Those include issues like China buying more U.S. products and China agreeing to reduce the U.S.-China trade deficit in principle, though it's not quite sure how they're going to manage to do that. And then more freedom and more rights given to U.S. firms operating in China, as well as tougher enforcement of existing intellectual property protection laws in China. So those issues have been worked out. What's remaining has to do, as the story just said, has to do with the longer term, more structural, longer policy development issues. For example, forced technology transfers by Chinese companies on foreign companies, including the Americans, subsidies to state-owned enterprises, Belt and Road Initiative, Made in China 2025 program, where they're trying to advance their manufacturing sector and upgrade their technology, overcapacity in certain industries like steel, and then this is probably going to be the biggest sticking point, but timetable for enforcement and verification. I think a lot of Chinese government officials, as well as even the Chinese public, think that that's allowing a bit too much for America because, well, it's not only limiting the freedom of Chinese policy, but they're going to have approval over it. So those are still issues remaining, and those are not easily solvable issues.
President Trump did speak of these talks that just happened in glowing terms, but as you said, there were difficulties, and he stressed that any deal right now has yet to be finally reached, and that he said he would need to perhaps meet with Xi Jinping to make the deal go through. But at the moment, there's been no date set for this meeting, and he also stressed that he would only accept a big deal with China. What does this mean by a big deal, and do you think they're close to getting it?
Okay, well, typically what happens in these trade negotiations with a deadline is that they solve all the easier problems first, which they did, and then they both sides hunker down on few very important issues, and they play a game of chicken. So they both try to outweigh each other, try to just make the issues more critical, more bigger, so that they could have a bigger leverage. USTR Lighthizer said that he's open to possibility of letting the tariffs go even higher. So things usually get worse before it gets better, and then usually, not always, but usually you have a dramatic agreement right before the deadline or right after deadline. So that's they seem to be following that scenario more or less here. USTR Lighthizer is giving some pessimistic indications, while President Trump is giving some optimistic interpretations. as to when they will meet, American press is saying that both sides would like to meet right after President Trump's meeting with Kim Jong-un. And that's going to be at the end of February, so it's going to be probably at the very end of February or very early March. If both sides are fairly close together, then they'll probably just delay the implementation of the tariffs. But if both sides are still far apart, then they may just, the U.S. might decide to raise the tariffs.
When you talk about the deadline, let's look at that. So it's actually March 1st, the deadline. And so from March 2nd, the US, at the moment, they've said they're not going to delay this raising of tariffs, which is they're going to raise tariffs of $200 billion worth of Chinese goods from 10% to 25%. So do you think, I mean, is there an option to delay that? How difficult would it be? Or is it just up to the whim of the White House?
Well, President Trump delayed, gave the 90-day delay for implementing the tariffs. The U.S. trade laws do give a lot of flexibility to the president and the executive branch. So if two sides were very close to agreement, then I think to blow that by increasing the tariffs for a week or two and gaining the ire of Chinese public as well as American firms, I think that'll not be a very smart decision. On the other hand, if they were still far apart on some of these issues, then as USTR Lighthizer said, they were just perfectly willing to use higher tariffs as a bargaining tool.
You also mentioned the meeting with Kim Jong-un. That's at the moment scheduled for the late February, and Pompeo and Trump have both reiterated it the last couple of days. But we've seen it in the past before where meetings with North Korea can get delayed, you know, things happen. What happens if it does get delayed? So do you think it'll be forced to delay this deadline as well? I think they'll be flexible about it. If North Korea wants a delay that's more than a week, let's say, then they may, President Trump and Xi may have separate meetings, or they may schedule the meeting, China-US meeting before the US-North Korea meeting. And something that's occurred to me as well, what happens if there's another US shutdown like there was recently? Because at the moment, there's no deal to extend the federal government either at the moment. Well, there's usually some emergency funds that they can use, and a lot of these high officials will probably have to work without a salary. But I don't see the shutdown specifically having that much problem arranging this meeting, because President Trump is putting a lot into the North Korean as well as the Chinese negotiations. So I don't think shutdown itself is going to be a problem for that. What I am a bit more worried about is that if the situation is delayed a bit more and the U.S. is scheduled for raising the debt limit, and if President Trump tries to use that as a negotiating tool for his wall, then that's going to cause a lot more problems than the shutdown. And if he does that, then the meeting could be up for grabs. Just before these the latest talks in Washington, it was announced that the U.S. had filed 13 criminal charges against the Chinese tech giant Huawei. And when asked about the matter, Trump said that they hadn't really been discussed in these talks. He in fact said, as long as it is as big as it may seem, it's actually very small compared to the overall deal. Would you agree with that assessment? And how do you think this Huawei situation plays into the current trade talks? Okay, well, the Chinese public, I think, definitely do see the Huawei as part of the problem with the United States. But as far as using that, including that in the negotiation, I don't think the Chinese officials, as well as the U.S. officials, would like to do that. On the U.S. side, these type of criminal proceedings are supposed to be separate from trade proceedings. President Trump got into a lot of trouble because he had a tweet saying that, well, if U.S. and China could make an agreement, then perhaps he could be more merciful toward Huawei and Ms. Meng, who's right now in Canada in jail, on bail. He got a lot of criticism from that because legally in the United States, the criminal issue and the trade issue has to be separate. And as you just mentioned, on the China side, Huawei is a big company, but still in terms of total Chinese trade, Chinese economy, Huawei is still a very small part. So I don't think they would want to mix that issue with the trade negotiation. So what comes next? I mean, what are we looking at now? There's a lot of uncertainty and it's making the global economy quite nervous. How long are we expecting these trade talks to continue, in your opinion?
Okay, well, they will definitely have to wait until President Trump and President Xi have their meeting. Both sides reiterated that no deal will be final until they talk with each other, which is a bit unusual because usually when you have a trade negotiation, the only thing the presidents show up for is the signing at the very end. Most of the technical details are actually worked out by experts well beforehand. But there does seem to be a possibility that they will be doing their own personal wheeling and dealing here. So it basically depends on when the meeting between President Trump and President Xi can be arranged. And that, as we mentioned before, is still a bit up to question.
US and China, obviously South Korea's biggest trade partners, so anything that happens between them will affect South Korea as well. So there are already signs that the dispute is having a negative impact on the South Korean economy. So what does South Korea do here at the moment? Is there anything they can do, or do we just wait for now?
Okay, well, just in terms of bilateral trade between Korea and China, I don't think we have that much choice other than to wait. Korea, about 45% of Korean GDP is exports, and of that, quarter of it goes to China. So the share of Chinese exports in Korea GDP is about 10–11%. So any reduction in Chinese economy due to the trade war or their economic slowdown is bound to have effect on Korean bilateral trade. But the US-China trade war may not have as much effect as people fear. In Chinese GDP, exports are only about 20% of their GDP, and then of that 20%, exports to the United States, it's only about 20% of that. So altogether, maybe about 4% of GDP depends on exports to the United States. With this additional tariffs, maybe about 0.5 to 1% of the trade would be affected, the shock from China, at least from the trade war, may not be as big as people fear. From January to October last year, which is the latest figure that they have, the exports from China to the United States only fell by about 7%. So we may be overly frightened of the trade war, but there's another problem, which is economic slowdown in China, which is probably going to be a bigger problem. So we may be worried about the correct problem for the wrong reason.
One more thing we want to talk to you about before we go as well. So investors have been closely watching the US Federal Reserve's announcement this week over whether it was going to raise interest rates at the central bank, as the central bank hinted last year. But in fact, they decided to hold it. They decided to keep it where it is. And they added that they will be patient in setting future adjustments. What effect does this holding have for everyone else, including Korea right now?
Okay, well, the effect just after the announcement was that the stock market and the bond market, because they also announced that they would reduce their selling of the government bonds that the Fed piled up during the quantitative easing they had during the global financial crisis aftermath. So at the very beginning, not raising the interest rate, keeping the sales of bonds low means that there's more room for Wall Street traders to maneuver, more chances of profitability. So the stock market went up, the bond market went up. But then I think they're looking at the longer picture now. Why did the Fed change their view so quickly and so much? They were saying that, well, just until about a month ago, they were saying maybe 2 increases this year. The United States economy is relatively healthy. It can stand a few more interest rate rises. But suddenly they said, we're going neutral. We're not going to raise it anymore. And there's even a possibility of going back to quantitative easing. So what changed? And I think that's making some analysts begin to get nervous.
And what about this overall effects that could happen to China, to South Korea as well? Because the South Korean, the Bank of Korea governor, he said this will help stabilize the financial markets. So isn't that good news for South Korea?
Well, more money is flowing into emerging markets over January because nobody expected the Fed to raise the rates. A lot of money has been flowing into the KOSPI stock markets in Korea, as well as the emerging markets. But now I think people are beginning to realize that, well, the Fed's change in point of view does mean that the global slowdown may be real. And so I think that's making more and more people nervous. And another problem is that the real, over the last 15 years or so, the real economy and the financial sector doesn't really go hand in hand together. So whenever the economic outlook worsens, so the central bank reduces interest rates, stock market actually goes up. Having the financial market being stabilized doesn't always mean that the real economy will be stabilized. And for people who have jobs, for company owners, it's the real economy which matters more than the financial economy.
That's where we'll have to wrap it up. Thank you for coming in today and sharing us your insights as always.
Thank you.
And that's all for today. Next week is the Lunar New Year holiday, also known as Seol here in Korea. So I'll be back on Thursday. In the meantime, we will have our newscasts at 12 and 6 p.m. Korea time during that period. So do tune in then for the latest updates. Thank you for watching and hope our viewers in Korea have a great Seol holiday. Goodbye.
Zooming into Arirang. In 2018, a wind of peace blew over the Korean